In the first days of January 2020, life in a remote indigenous community in rural Panama followed a rhythm that had changed very little over decades. Mornings began early. Families rose with the light tending small plots of land, preparing food, walking narrow dirt paths between homes built close to relatives rather than roads. Children moved freely between households. Adults worked, rested, prayed. There were no sirens, no police vehicles, no visible signs of crisis. Religious gatherings were part of this normality. Prayer was not confined to a single building or denomination. Faith blended into daily life, spoken quietly, practiced collectively, rarely questioned. From the outside, there was nothing to suggest that violence was imminent. The community appeared calm, stable, and familiar with itself. This sense of normalcy matters. It reminds us that extreme acts rarely announce themselves. The community's isolation was not only cultural, but geographic. Dense forests surrounded the area, limiting access to a few difficult routes. Travel to larger towns required time, resources, and physical endurance. In practical terms, this meant that the presence of the state was minimal. Law enforcement visits were infrequent. Healthcare services were distant. Social and psychological support systems were largely absent. In this environment, religion did more than offer spiritual comfort. It functioned as a framework for moral judgment, social order, and conflict resolution. When disputes arose, they were handled internally. When suffering appeared, it was often interpreted through spiritual language rather than medical or psychological terms. This does not suggest ignorance. It suggests adaptation. In the absence of alternatives, belief becomes infrastructure. Within this broader community existed a small religious group calling itself La Nueva Luz de Dios. Its membership was limited, composed mostly of extended family members. The group did not draw large crowds, did not seek attention, and did not openly challenge other religious practices in the area. From available records and testimony, the group was not initially perceived as dangerous. Its activities were largely invisible to outsiders, conducted on private land, away from communal spaces. There were no formal complaints, no recorded interventions. In many ways, the group blended into the background of everyday religious diversity. At this stage, there was little reason for concern. At the center of the group was an older male community member. He occupied several roles at once: farmer, local political figure, and spiritual leader. These identities overlapped rather than conflicted, reinforcing his authority. He was known familiar and embedded in the social fabric of the village. His adult son had recently returned after spending time in other communities. According to later testimony, he claimed to have received a spiritual revelation. There is no documented criminal history for either man prior to these events. No evidence at this point of planning violence. What existed instead was influence and trust. This case is not a mystery about who committed the acts that followed. The individuals involved were identified, arrested, and sentenced. The analytical value of this case lies elsewhere. It asks how belief hardens into certainty, how certainty begins to override moral restraint, and how violence can emerge quietly in places where authority goes unquestioned and alternatives do not exist. Extreme violence does not always emerge from visible hatred or chaos. Sometimes it develops slowly in silence, shaped by certainty, isolation, and the absence of limits. In the weeks leading up to mid-January 2020, subtle changes began to register within the community. According to later testimony, some residents noticed religious practices that felt unusual in tone, if not in form. Prayer sessions grew longer. Interpretations became more literal, more urgent. Certain members withdrew from communal gatherings and began meeting in private. Secrecy increased. Movement shifted toward a secluded property surrounded by dense vegetation. On their own, these behaviors were not criminal. In many religious settings, isolation and intense devotion are not unusual. What matters analytically is not any single act, but the pattern they formed over time. At this stage, the pattern suggested consolidation rather than violence, an inward turn that narrowed influence and reduced external scrutiny. A key transition appears to have followed the return of the leader's adult son. He had spent several months traveling through nearby communities, interacting with other religious figures. When he came back, he presented himself as changed. According to witness accounts, he claimed to have received divine instruction. He adopted a new spiritual identity and began speaking with a heightened sense of authority. His language shifted from shared belief to revealed truth. More notably, he began reframing the moral landscape of the community. Certain behaviors, illnesses, and disagreements were no longer seen as human problems. They were reinterpreted as signs of spiritual contamination. The line between believer and threat became less stable. This reframing is significant. It suggests a cognitive shift from inclusion to purification, a move that often precedes coercive control. As the group's internal language changed, so did its behavior. Terms like guidance and correction were gradually replaced with salvation and corruption. Fear became a tool. The idea that harm could spread unseen and unchecked began to justify intervention. Witnesses later described the introduction of coercion. Requests became demands. Participation became compulsory. The group's members began entering homes at night, confronting individuals accused of harboring malign influences. These actions marked a clear escalation. Crossing the threshold of another person's home uninvited and under threat represents a shift from belief to enforcement. At this point, the group was no longer only defining morality. It was policing it. Several individuals were taken against their will. They were restrained and transported to the group's religious site, a location deliberately chosen for its isolation. Once there, they were subjected to what the group described as exorcism rituals. Participation was not optional. Resistance was interpreted as confirmation of possession. The process followed a consistent structure, suggesting planning rather than improvisation. From an analytical perspective, the presence of structure matters. It indicates that the violence was ritualized, not reactive. Survivor testimony and medical reports describe a sequence of acts repeated across victims. Clothing was removed. Bodies were restrained. Individuals were struck with objects carrying religious symbolism. Pain was applied deliberately and sustained over time. In this framework, suffering was not incidental. It was interpreted as evidence that the ritual was working. Vomiting in particular was seen as a sign of expulsion, physical distress, redefined as spiritual success. This reinterpretation of bodily harm is central to understanding the escalation. Once pain becomes proof of righteousness, limits dissolve. Medical examinations later confirmed severe injuries consistent with prolonged physical abuse. Survivor accounts provide the clearest sequence of events, though they vary in detail and timing. Some moments remain unverified, lost to fear, confusion, or absence of witnesses. The record is silent on certain transitions, when belief became permission, when permission became obligation. The escalation was not sudden. It followed a gradual redefinition of violence from harm to necessity, to perceived moral duty. The victims in this case were not strangers to the perpetrators. They were women and children, including a pregnant woman bound to the group by blood marriage and shared daily life. Their identities mattered not only as victims, but as people whose social positions limited their ability to resist. They lived within a structure that emphasized family cohesion and spiritual obedience. Economic dependence, geographic isolation, and emotional ties reduced options for escape. For children, resistance was not a realistic possibility. For adults especially, women resistance carried the risk of social and familial exile. What stands out in the record is not passivity, but constraint. The victim's circumstances suggest that survival often depended on compliance, at least until an opportunity to flee appeared. Violence within extended family systems carries a distinct psychological weight. In this case, kinship appears to have functioned as a mechanism of enforcement rather than protection. Obedience was framed as loyalty. Questioning authority was equated with betrayal of faith, of family of identity. This dynamic is significant. When moral authority is embedded within family hierarchy, resistance becomes psychologically costly. To refuse is not only to disobey a leader, but to reject one's place within the group. For many, that cost may have felt greater than enduring harm. It suggests that control was maintained not primarily through physical force, but through relational pressure. Some individuals did escape. Their actions, described later in testimony, involved fleeing through dense forest, often at night, with limited resources and no clear destination. These escapes were not immediate. They followed prolonged exposure to fear and coercion. The delay in reporting is notable. Survivors hesitated before speaking to authorities. Their accounts were fragmented, sometimes inconsistent in sequence or detail. From a psychological perspective, this does not undermine credibility. It may indicate acute stress confusion and internal conflict. Survivors were not only recounting violence, they were navigating the emotional consequences of implicating family members and dismantling a belief system that had once offered meaning. Silence in this context appears less like concealment and more like paralysis. Descriptions of the perpetrator's behavior during the rituals reveal an absence of panic or disorganization. The acts followed a repeated structure. Roles were assigned. Witnesses were present within the group. This pattern suggests that the violence was not impulsive. It was procedural. The presence of observers did not inhibit behavior. It reinforced it. Each act was performed within a shared framework that normalized harm. There is no evidence of attempts to conceal injuries during the acts themselves. Pain was not hidden. It was central to the ritual. This matters because it differentiates the behavior from crimes driven by rage or loss of control. What emerges instead is a system in which violence was expected, rehearsed, and justified. Following the deaths, the response was quiet. Bodies were buried in a communal grave. There was no immediate attempt to flee the area. Other individuals remained detained. This behavior may indicate a lack of perceived wrongdoing. There is no clear evidence of panic or improvisation after the deaths occurred. Life within the group appears to have continued, at least briefly, under the same internal logic. From an analytical standpoint, this suggests that the deaths were not experienced as failures or accidents. They may have been interpreted as outcomes within an accepted moral framework. Taken together, these behaviors may suggest several overlapping psychological mechanisms. Moral disengagement appears present, allowing individuals to reinterpret harm as necessity. Diffusion of responsibility within the group reduced individual accountability. Belief-driven justification reframed suffering as meaningful and purposeful. Notably, these patterns are not consistent with crimes motivated by profit concealment or escape. There was no effort to erase evidence, no attempt to gain materially, no rapid flight. What appears instead is a closed belief system that no longer recognized harm as harm. The absence of visible remorse does not necessarily indicate cruelty. It may indicate a belief system that has lost the ability to recognize suffering as wrongdoing. When authorities were finally alerted, time had already been lost. The community's location imposed immediate constraints. Dense forest, limited roads, and long distances made ground access slow and unreliable. Investigators ultimately relied on air transport to reach the area. These delays were not the result of indecision. They were logistical. In regions like this, response time is shaped less by urgency than by geography. By the time officials arrived, critical moments had already passed. Scenes had changed. People had moved. Some evidence had never been preserved. From an investigative standpoint, the clock had started late. One of the defining features of this case is not what investigators found, but what they could not. There were no surveillance cameras, no phone records, no digital communications to reconstruct movement or intent. Written records were minimal. Many events occurred on private land beyond any formal documentation. As a result, large portions of the timeline were reconstructed solely through survivor testimony and partial witness accounts. This does not mean those accounts were unreliable. It means they carried a disproportionate weight. When testimony becomes the primary source of reconstruction, gaps are inevitable. Memory is shaped by fear, stress, and trauma. Some moments blur, others disappear entirely. The record in many places remains silent. Language differences further complicated the investigation. Some community members spoke indigenous languages more fluently than Spanish. Translation introduced delays and potential loss of nuance. Distrust of authorities also played a role. Prior experiences of neglect had taught residents that reporting problems did not always lead to protection. For some, silence felt safer than engagement. This context matters. The absence of early reporting was not simply hesitation. It may indicate a learned expectation that intervention would come too late or not at all. In such environments, crimes are not only committed in isolation, they are processed in isolation. For the families of the victims, the lack of complete information created its own form of harm. Questions remained unanswered. Timelines were incomplete. The final moments of loved ones could not be fully reconstructed. Silence in this context was often interpreted as indifference, not necessarily from investigators, but from the system itself. When records are thin, closure becomes elusive. Families were left with fragments, medical findings, court rulings, partial narratives without a cohesive story. For many, that absence became part of the trauma. Investigators faced a different kind of burden. Working with incomplete timelines required constant inference. Establishing precise sequences proved difficult. Some decisions had to be made without corroborating data. This uncertainty carries an emotional toll. Professionals trained to rely on evidence found themselves navigating ambiguity. The inability to confirm certain details does not diminish the seriousness of the case, but it complicates interpretation. Here, restraint became necessary. Conclusions had to be limited to what could be supported, even when broader questions remained unresolved. It is tempting to interpret gaps in a case file as failure of intelligence, of diligence, of will. This case suggests something more complex. The silences here are the result of structural absence. A lack of infrastructure documentation and sustained institutional presence created conditions in which information was never generated. This helps explain how cases can move toward a cold status, even after arrests and convictions. Not because answers are hidden, but because they were never recorded. Understanding this distinction is essential. It shifts focus from individual blame to systemic limitation. Cases become cold not only when answers are concealed, but when the conditions to record them never existed in the first place. In late 2021, the judicial process reached its formal conclusion. Multiple members of the group were arrested, prosecuted, and sentenced. The most severe penalties reached up to 50 years in prison. From a legal standpoint, the case was resolved. The individuals responsible were identified. The acts were named. The punishment was imposed. Within the framework of the justice system, this marked an ending. Law serves specific functions, and in this case, It fulfilled them. Accountability was established. Those who carried out the violence were removed from the community. The immediate threat ended. The court's ruling recognized the harm done to the victims and affirmed that the acts constituted serious crimes. For the state, this resolution restored a measure of order. It signaled that even in remote places, certain lines cannot be crossed without consequence. Yet legal resolution is not the same as psychological or social closure. Despite the sentences, significant questions remain unanswered. The full psychological motivations behind the perpetrator's actions cannot be reconstructed with certainty. We do not know the precise sequence of the victim's final moments. We do not have access to the internal states of those who inflicted the harm, what doubts they may have had, if any, or how they interpreted the outcomes of their actions. The record offers fragments, not interior lives. Court transcripts can establish responsibility, but they cannot fully capture belief. In cases like this, the absence of detail is not a failure of inquiry. It is a reflection of the limits of what can be known after the fact. There is little indication that further forensic or technological advances will significantly alter our understanding of this case. The injuries were documented. The deaths were explained in medical terms. The identities of victims and perpetrators were confirmed. Technology can identify bodies. It can document wounds. It can support timelines. What it cannot do is reconstruct conviction. Belief leaves few measurable traces. It does not appear on scans or in databases. When actions are driven by internal certainty rather than external gain, evidence can explain what happened without revealing why it felt justified. This case is not about evil as spectacle. It is not a story of chaos erupting without warning. It is a study in how certainty replaces doubt and how that certainty can override restraint when no counterbalance exists. The violence did not emerge from secrecy alone, but from conviction reinforced by isolation. It suggests that danger lies not only in hatred, but in absolute confidence, especially when it is insulated from challenge. The value of analyzing cases like this does not lie in reopening verdicts or searching for hidden twists. It lies in learning how ordinary structures can fail and how human conviction can expand to fill the void they leave behind. Some questions will remain unanswered. The record will stay silent in places. That silence is not an obstacle to understanding. It is part of it. True crime analysis at its most honest does not always deliver resolution. Sometimes it asks us to sit with discomfort, to acknowledge uncertainty, and to recognize that understanding human behavior does not require complete answers, only careful attention. The value of studying cases like this lies not in solving them again, but in understanding how ordinary structures can fail and how human conviction can fill that void with irreversible consequences.